A family turns the key in their driveway, and the car does not rumble. It lights off like something from an airport ramp, building a thin, rising whine under the hood. Just listen to what their neighbors heard. If you want more stories where the future almost reached ordinary driveways, subscribe to Forgotten Detroit. This was not a movie prop, and it was not reserved for racers, executives, or celebrities. In 1963, Chrysler built 55 turbine cars, finished them in bronze paint, and handed 50 of them to regular American households for real-world testing. People took them to grocery stores, schools, church parking lots, and suburban garages. They drove a car powered by a jet-age turbine, then gave Chrysler their impressions. Then Chrysler took them back. Most were crushed or destroyed. If this machine was supposed to be the future of the automobile, why did it disappear? By the time Chrysler put a turbine into a family car, America had already been trained to believe the future would arrive with a jet exhaust trail behind it. After the Second World War, jet aircraft were breaking speed records, rockets were climbing higher than any airplane, and atomic power was being sold as the start of a cleaner, more powerful age. Car companies could feel that excitement. Detroit was no longer just selling transportation, it was selling tomorrow, with tail fins, bubble canopies, chrome, and dashboards that looked like aircraft controls. The gas turbine fit that world perfectly. A normal piston engine depended on hundreds of parts moving back and forth in a violent chain of tiny explosions. Pistons, rods, valves, camshafts, spark timing, cooling systems, and vibration all had to be managed at once. A turbine seemed almost elegant by comparison. Air went in, fuel burned, hot gases spun turbine wheels, and power came out in one continuous motion. That simplicity was not just a styling gimmick. Turbines had fewer major moving parts than piston engines. They ran smoothly because their main components rotated instead of hammered up and down. They did not shake the car in the same familiar way, and they could make power without the constant mechanical clatter drivers associated with ordinary engines. Then came the promise that sounded almost too good for a nation obsessed with freedom and convenience. The turbine could burn many different fuels. Chrysler engineers demonstrated versions that could run on gasoline, diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, and other combustible liquids. In public imagination, that made the car feel nearly universal, less tied to one fuel pump and more like a machine ready for any future. For Detroit, this was not science fiction. It was a possible answer to the biggest question in the industry. What would replace the piston engine if something better finally arrived? Chrysler's problem was proving that aircraft logic could survive life on the ground. A turbine might look brilliant in a test cell, but ordinary Americans did not drive test cells. They drove in traffic, stopped at red lights, idled at schools, parked at supermarkets, and loaded the trunk for family vacations. Chrysler's turbine story did not begin with the bronze coupe in 1963. It started decades earlier, inside an engineering department that had been studying gas turbines before most Americans had ever seen a jet aircraft. By the late 1930s, Chrysler engineers were already looking at turbine power for vehicles. Then, in 1945, the company received a U.S. Navy contract to develop a turboprop aircraft engine. That project did not put a Chrysler turbine into production, but it gave the company something valuable: experience with compressors, combustion chambers, heat, materials, and the brutal problem of making turbine machinery reliable. After 1949, Chrysler began turning that knowledge toward automobiles. Engineers knew a car turbine could not simply be copied from an airplane. It had to start quickly, respond to a driver's foot, survive stop-and-go traffic, and deliver usable torque without turning the exhaust into a street-level furnace. The first public breakthrough came in 1954, when Chrysler installed a turbine engine into a Plymouth-based test car. It was not sleek science fiction. It looked like a normal car, because the point was to prove the engine, not the styling. That car showed Chrysler could package a turbine in an automobile and make it move under its own power on real roads. From there, the company kept building development cars. Plymouth bodies carried newer turbine generations through the 1950s and early 1960s. Each version attacked a specific weakness: slow throttle response, high fuel consumption, hot exhaust, noise, and the complicated business of transferring turbine power to ordinary driving wheels. That made the engine more efficient and helped tame one of the turbine's biggest problems. Chrysler engineers also refined starting systems, transmissions, and controls until the car felt less like a laboratory machine and more like something a family could operate. By the time the famous turbine car appeared, Chrysler had spent years removing reasons it should not work. The next step was risky. Instead of hiding prototypes behind proving ground fences, Chrysler decided to let ordinary drivers judge the future from behind the wheel. What Chrysler revealed in 1963 did not look like a warmed-over test mule. It looked like a car that had escaped from an auto show turntable and somehow landed in American traffic. The body was built by Ghia in Turin, Italy, the same coach builder associated with elegant European show cars and limited production designs. Chrysler supplied the engineering, but Ghia shaped the skin. A low, bronze-copper hardtop coupe with long luxury car proportions, a clean roofline, and just enough restraint to make the whole thing believable. After the bodies were completed in Italy, they were shipped to Detroit for final assembly, where Chrysler installed the turbine drivetrain and finished the cars for the road. The result was not a tiny experimental pod or a bare-bones science project. It had 2 doors, 4 seats, power steering, power brakes, an automatic transmission selector, and an interior trimmed like something a real customer might expect from a premium Chrysler product. That mattered, because the company was not only showing off an engine, it was packaging the future inside a familiar American luxury coupe. Still, nothing about it blended in. The front end had a sharp, purposeful look, with headlights set into sculpted fenders. The rear was even more dramatic, with taillights shaped like turbine exhausts, as if the styling department wanted everyone behind the car to understand what powered it. In a world of chrome sedans, station wagons, and compact economy cars, the turbine car looked low, sleek, and strangely expensive. Chrysler built 55 turbine cars in total. 5 were prototypes, and 50 were prepared for the public test program. That number was large enough to gather real-world feedback, but small enough to make each car feel like a rolling artifact. It looked like a dream car. Chrysler's question was more practical. Could this exotic machine behave like a normal car? Under the hood sat the part that made the Chrysler turbine car more than a styling exercise: the 4th-generation A831 gas turbine engine. On paper, it did not sound outrageous. Chrysler rated it at around 130 horsepower, which was normal for an American passenger car of the early 1960s. The more eye-catching figure was torque, about 425 pound-feet. That was big car territory, and it arrived from an engine with far fewer familiar parts than a V8. A piston engine makes power through thousands of little explosions, pushing pistons up and down inside cylinders. Those pistons turn a crankshaft, the crankshaft sends power through the transmission, and the whole process repeats in pulses. A turbine works more like a continuous stream. Air is pulled in, compressed, mixed with fuel, and burned steadily. The hot gases rush through spinning turbine wheels, and that rotation becomes usable power. So instead of pistons, valves, spark plugs, and a camshaft, the A831 relied on high-speed rotating assemblies. Chrysler also used a regenerative system which captured heat from the exhaust and used it to warm incoming air. That helped efficiency, because turbine exhaust could otherwise waste a huge amount of heat. And yes, it sounded different. Not like a muscle car, not like a luxury sedan, and not like anything most drivers had heard at a traffic light. Just listen to the kind of sound Chrysler was putting into American suburbia. The strange part was how normal the rest of the drivetrain was. The turbine fed power through Chrysler's 3-speed TorqueFlite automatic transmission, one of the company's proven road car gearboxes. It drove the rear wheels, just like millions of conventional American cars. From the driver's seat, you still selected a gear, pressed the accelerator, and steered a large coupe down the road. That combination was the whole promise of the project. Chrysler had put aerospace-style combustion inside a car that used familiar controls and a familiar layout. But smoothness, torque, and futuristic engineering did not automatically make it easy to live with. The A831 had advantages: and it also had habits that ordinary drivers would notice immediately. Beginning in October 1963, Chrysler stopped treating the turbine car like a secret laboratory project and started handing the keys to ordinary Americans. The company selected more than 200 drivers and families across the United States for a public trial program. These were not professional racers, engineers, or stunt drivers. They were people with commutes, grocery runs, school schedules, weekend trips, and neighbors who would absolutely notice a bronze coupe in the driveway that sounded like it belonged at an airport. Each participant got the car for a limited period, usually about 3 months. Chrysler covered the special needs of the program, stayed in contact with the drivers, and expected detailed feedback. The families were supposed to use the cars normally, not preserve them like museum pieces. They drove them through traffic, parked them at shopping centers, started them on cold mornings, and found out whether a turbine engine could fit into routines built around conventional cars. That was the information Chrysler wanted. How reliable was it outside a proving ground? How often did it need attention? Did the starting procedure confuse people? Did the throttle response feel strange? Could a driver live with the sound, the heat, the fuel habits, and the attention? A test track could measure performance, but it could not measure what happened when a family had to explain the car to a gas station attendant. The boldness of the program is easy to miss now. Chrysler was not just showing a futuristic concept at auto shows. It put experimental powertrains into real neighborhoods, then let non-experts expose every inconvenience, flaw, and surprise. For a brief moment, prototype turbine technology was not sealed behind factory gates. It was sitting in American driveways, being judged by the same standard as any other car. Can it handle everyday life? And that raises the question Chrysler most needed answered. What was it actually like to live with a jet-age car? Starting the turbine car was not like twisting a key and hearing pistons catch. The driver had to treat it more like lighting a small aircraft engine. Chrysler built in a specific sequence, with the ignition key, the gear selector, and a starter button all playing a part. The engine did not bark awake, it spooled up. That spool up mattered because it changed the whole first impression. A normal car announced itself with vibration through the floor, a shake through the steering wheel, and the uneven pulse of combustion. The turbine car came alive as a rising mechanical whine, then settled into a high, smooth idle that sounded closer to airport equipment than traffic. Once moving, many drivers noticed what was missing. There was no familiar engine rumble under acceleration, no shifting feel from a conventional transmission, and very little vibration. The car used a torque converter, so it could pull away smoothly, but the sensation was unusual. Pressing the accelerator did not produce the same immediate mechanical response people expected from a piston engine. That delay became one of the car's daily quirks. Drivers learned to press the pedal a moment earlier than they might in an ordinary car, especially when merging or pulling into traffic. The turbine could build power, but it delivered it in its own rhythm. Smooth cruising was where the car felt most natural. At steady road speeds, it could glide with a polished, almost detached feel. The heat was another reminder that this was not a normal engine. Chrysler's regenerators recovered exhaust heat to improve efficiency, but the turbine still managed extremely hot gases inside the system. Engineers had worked hard to make the car safe for streets and garages, yet owners were still living with hardware that belonged to a very different mechanical world. Refueling added to the legend, and also to the fine print. The turbine could run on gasoline, diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, and even other combustible liquids. Chrysler liked to demonstrate that flexibility because it made the car seem ready for any future fuel shortage. In practice, fuel freedom did not erase the problems. Different fuels could affect smell, deposits, starting behavior, and emissions. The car still had to meet real-world expectations for convenience and economy. The turbine car could drink almost anything, but that did not mean America was ready to live on the wine. The public test program gave Chrysler something more valuable than applause. It gave them ordinary complaints from ordinary drivers, and those complaints exposed the gap between a brilliant engineering demonstration and a car people would actually buy. The throttle response was one of the clearest issues. In a piston car, pressing the accelerator gave drivers an immediate change in sound and pull. In the turbine car, the engine needed time to spool, so the reaction could feel delayed, especially from a stop or during a quick pass. Chrysler engineers understood why it happened, but drivers judged it by the traffic around them. If the car hesitated when they expected it to leap forward, the explanation did not matter much. Acceleration also depended on conditions. The turbine car could cruise smoothly at highway speeds, but it was not a muscle car, and it did not always feel strong in the situations where American drivers wanted instant confidence. Pulling away from an intersection, climbing a grade, or merging into faster traffic could make the car feel less impressive than its futuristic body suggested. The promise sounded like jet power. The experience was often more like patient, polished momentum. Then there was the sound. Some people loved the high turbine whine because it made every drive feel special. Others found it strange, tiring, or simply out of place in a family car. Chrysler had built something quieter in vibration than a conventional engine, but quiet was not the same as familiar. A car could be smooth and still feel wrong if the driver never fully adjusted to what it was doing. Fuel economy became the hardest problem to ignore. Turbines were efficient in certain steady operating conditions, but daily driving was full of stops, starts, short trips, and idling. In that world, the turbine car could use fuel heavily. Its ability to burn different fuels made great publicity, but real owners still cared about how often they had to fill the tank. By the end of the test, Chrysler had proved that regular Americans could live with a turbine car for a few months. That was not the same as proving they would choose one in a showroom, pay for it, service it, and recommend it. The fantasy of an imminent turbine future survived the excitement, but the business case was starting to crack. The turbine car was not just a strange engine in an ordinary Chrysler. Almost everything about it made it expensive before it ever reached a dealership. The bodies were built by Ghia in Italy, not stamped out in huge numbers on a Detroit assembly line. Each car had hand-finished details, bronze paint, custom interiors, and a shape meant to announce that it came from the future. That made the public test fleet look glamorous, but it also hid a basic manufacturing problem. A normal Chrysler could spread tooling, labor, and supplier costs across hundreds of thousands of cars. The turbine program could not. The engine was even more difficult. Chrysler had spent years improving turbine hardware, using specialized materials, tight tolerances, and parts that were nothing like a conventional V8. In a mass-produced car, a piston engine benefited from decades of factory experience and a giant parts network. A turbine engine needed a new production system, new service knowledge, and expensive components that only made sense if volume became high enough. That was the trap. To make the turbine cheaper, Chrysler needed to build many of them. To build many of them, Chrysler needed confidence that buyers would pay for them. Some estimates suggested that a low-volume production turbine car could cost far more than a comparable V8 car, possibly enough to push it out of the reach of the ordinary Americans who had made the test program so powerful. At the same time, the outside world was changing. Fuel economy mattered more as buyers paid closer attention to operating costs. Emissions were becoming a serious engineering and legal problem, not just a laboratory concern. Turbines produced exhaust differently from piston engines, and reducing certain pollutants while keeping the car affordable and efficient became harder as regulations tightened. Chrysler had collected more than 1 million miles of public driving data. The experiment had proved the cars could work in real life, but it had also revealed what real production would demand. Now the company faced the decision built into the program from the beginning. The drivers had to give the cars back. When the public test ended, Chrysler did not sell the turbine cars to the families who had driven them. It took them back. Then, in one of the most painful endings in automotive history, the company destroyed 46 of the 55 cars. That decision has made the story sound, for decades, like a buried miracle. A working jet-powered car reached ordinary driveways, then the corporation crushed the evidence. The real explanation was less cinematic, but still frustrating. These were prototypes, not production cars. Automakers routinely scrapped experimental vehicles after test programs because they were never certified, documented, or supported like normal consumer products. If Chrysler had allowed private owners to keep them, the company could have faced years of liability for machines with unique engines, unique parts, and no ordinary service network. There was also a customs problem. The bodies had been built by Ghia in Italy and imported into the United States under rules that treated them as temporary test vehicles. Keeping them in America permanently could have triggered duties and legal complications that made the cars even more expensive to retain. Destroying most of them was a clean, if brutal, way to close the books. Chrysler did save 9. A few went to museums, a few remained with the company, and the survivors became some of the most valuable and recognizable concept cars ever built. Their existence proves this was not an attempt to erase the program completely. But the loss still hurts because these cars were not just engineering samples. They had lived in suburbs, carried groceries, picked up children, and sat in ordinary garages while neighbors came over to stare. For a short time, the future had not been locked behind a show stand or a proving ground fence. People had driven it to work. Then most of that future was cut apart, not because it had secretly succeeded, but because it had not succeeded enough. The turbine car was flawed, expensive, and unfinished. It was also real. That is what made its destruction feel like more than disposal. It felt like watching tomorrow get taken back. Chrysler did not walk away from turbine power when the public program ended. Behind the scenes, the company kept building new engines, testing new materials, and trying to turn the glamorous experiment into something that could survive a showroom. The next generations were smaller, cleaner, and more practical than the engine in the bronze turbine car. Engineers worked on better heat exchangers, faster throttle response, lower noise, and ways to cut the high fuel consumption that had always haunted the design. The goal was no longer just proving that a turbine car could be driven by ordinary people. The goal was making one that could meet ordinary regulations, ordinary budgets, and ordinary expectations. That became harder as the 1970s changed the car business. Fuel economy was no longer a secondary concern after the oil crisis. Emissions rules became stricter. A turbine could burn many fuels, but that flexibility did not automatically make it efficient or easy to certify. Chrysler needed an engine that was clean on paper, affordable to build, durable in traffic, and competitive with improving piston engines. The company pushed the idea all the way into the late 1970s. Prototype turbine engines were installed in later Chrysler vehicles, and the research continued until 1979. By then, Chrysler was fighting for survival. The company was losing money, seeking government-backed loans, and facing pressure to spend limited resources on cars it could sell quickly. In that environment, the turbine program became impossible to defend. It still carried high production cost, unresolved fuel economy problems, and uncertain emissions compliance. Government support for Chrysler did not come with room for an expensive engineering dream that might need years more development. So the dream did not die in one dramatic moment when the turbine cars were destroyed. It faded after years of serious work, as the gap between possibility and production refused to close. That leaves the real question. Were Americans almost given turbine-powered family cars, or were they only allowed to borrow an extraordinary experiment before the future moved on? So how close did we really get? Closer than most experimental cars ever come. Chrysler put turbine cars into the hands of ordinary American families, let them commute, shop, travel, and report back, and proved the machine could survive real life outside a laboratory. But close was not the same as ready. The turbine car was smooth, futuristic, durable, and able to run on different fuels. Yet it was also expensive to build, inefficient, slow to respond, and difficult to certify for the market that was emerging in the 1970s. That is why the surviving 9 cars matter so much. They are not just rare collectibles. They are artifacts from the moment Detroit briefly let regular people drive a version of the future, then decided the future could not pay for itself. Thanks for watching. Would you have wanted to be part of Chrysler's turbine test program? Write your answer in the comments.